I changed the title of my topic a little bit to fit the scope of the seminar series better. And recently I've been thinking a lot about the impact of a scale on movement analysis that we do using tracking data. And recently my work has been focused on contact tracing because of the COVID pandemic, and also using movement data at different scales to do analysis and modeling. So I want to start with basics of movement analytics, and the basic starts with collecting movement data. Movement data can be collected in many different ways with different sensors, as you know. We have two different methods of data collection. One would be the Lagrangian approach, that we attach a GPS sensor to an entity or an individual and track it over time. So we follow movement as the entity moves. And the other approach would be the Eulerian approach, which basically we capture the absence and presence of movement over time. So as entities interact with a set of a station, either Wi-Fi stands or QR scanners, or if you post like on Facebook or Twitter, your location is recorded over time, and then we know how many people interacted or passed by these stations. So it's more coarse in terms of granularity, and in GPS tracking in the Lagrangian movement, we have more detail depending on the resolution of the data on the movement of entities as they move over time. Either way, we can construct trajectories over time, which basically is defined as a set of ordered locations over time, so locations and time. And basically, we use these discrete trajectories as a set of points in the space and time to model movement and study movement. So this is a trajectory of one Galapagos albatrosses moving from Galapagos to the coast of Peru to Far Edge and back. So we use trajectories oftentimes as a very oversimplified version of movement. As you know, movement is continuous, but any study we do, we model and simplify things to be able to study them. Using this trajectory, we can derive a lot of information. So these trajectories carry a lot of information about the entities that move, either animals or humans. So we can, for example, calculate or compute distance traveled over time, or step lengths taken between two GPS points, or we can calculate the speed over time as, for example, the distance traveled over time. So that would be the ratio of distance over time. So there are many different parameters that we can calculate depending on the purpose of the study. Some of them requires only one GPS point, or oftentimes we need more than one GPS point to be able to compute these parameters. So because I want to talk about the impact of a scale in my analysis, I thought that I introduced this paper. If you haven't read this paper, I'm so inspired by the work Patrick Laube and Ross Purvis did in 2008 to look at how temporal granularity of GPS tracking data impacts the analysis of movement that we do. Starting with basics, calculating movement parameters such as speed, turn angle, or other movement parameters. So they did a set of studies to look to basically decompose or resample trajectories into different sampling intervals and calculate speed and other parameters over those sampling intervals. So the window, the temporal window changes or becomes bigger when you want to calculate like a speed over a coarser temporal analysis scale. They also looked at the impact of spatial uncertainty on calculation of movement parameters, and showed that there is an association actually between the temporal analysis scale and the spatial uncertainty. And depending on what temporal scale and uncertainty we have, we may want to consider the relationship between the two and look at the impact of the two on the analysis. So the result of their study showed that as the basically as the temporal scale increases, like greater window size, we get the median speed decreases, and also the variance in median in speed also decreases. So there is a clear impact here on speed. However, on turning angle and sinuosity, the impact is not as monotonous. They looked at this for 10 tracking trajectories of cows. And also they did a Monte Carlo simulation to look at the relationship between the impact of the scale and uncertainty. And I highly recommend this paper. So as the movement pandemic, as the COVID pandemic started, a lot of people turned into movement of people, and it has become a huge interest of a lot of researchers to look at movement and see the impact on the transmission of COVID-19, and also the measures that we can take to limit movement of people and exposure of people to COVID-19. So we've been lucky in terms of data these days. So it was very difficult before to find data set on movement, especially aggregate movement of people throughout cities. But since the beginning of the pandemic, as a lot of you know, a lot of companies like Cubic, Safegraph, Streetlight started to share their, also Apple and Google started to share their mobility data, which is computed based on GPS trajectories of cell phone devices that they see in their system. And there is a great dashboard now at your university, University of Maryland, that also provides a lot of indices for mobility. So with my colleagues at the University of California in Santa Barbara, we got a grant to look at the spatial and temporal heterogeneity of mobility and movement indices across the US, and also look at the impact of it on COVID-19 transmission. But what interested me most was that because now we have a lot of data sets available to us, I was very interested in differences between the data set and also the impact of the scale on these mobility indices that we calculate. For example, just as an example, my student Evgeny created this average percentage of shelter in place in Santa Barbara County using two different data sets, Safegraph and Cubic. And as you can see, there are some differences. And our research basically focuses to look at these differences also across space and time. However, today I would like to talk about another part of our research related to this grant on contact tracing. So CDC guidelines indicated that basically COVID-19 transmit based on spatial proximity when people get close to each other, and also exposure to respiratory droplets. Before they were suggesting that since the disease is airborne, the droplets might stay there for quite some time or on surfaces. Now they changed outline a little bit. But then that started a push for digital contact tracing apps and services throughout the globe, really. You can see some of the apps started like earlier in the pandemic. I didn't update this list, but now, for example, the US has it and different states have their own contact tracing app. And the idea is basically if you can track people over time, or if as you move in and in your daily life and you interact with different sensors that they can capture your location, if you can reconstruct the path of people and then intersect it and see who was close to who or who came into contact with whom, then we might be able to find out possible exposure to infected individuals using these services. And the reason was that because the manual contact tracing by calling people and asking about their path was not working as well, and people sometimes weren't willing to share information. So Apple and Google started this Bluetooth-based contact tracing technology in their mobile phone, and basically how it works is that if you come close to, if you're carrying a cell phone and the service is on, basically it tracks the number of cell phone devices that your cell phone comes into contact, within 6 feet of each other with another phone device. However, it doesn't capture your location or store your location, but it captures how many devices you came into contact, and it's based on the Bluetooth range and what your device sees. And then basically these two cell phone devices that came to contact, they exchange a key, and if an individual is infected, then a message is sent to other devices that are basically being in contact with this device, and hopefully that would help informing people that they came into contact with an infection or infected individual. So that is very similar to what movement ecologists have been doing on measuring dyadic interaction in animal movement. There are tons of measures out there to detect interaction between moving individuals, mainly in movement ecology context. And a lot of these measures basically measure static interaction, meaning that they measure the spatial overlap between moving individuals or activity space of moving individuals, other humans or animals. For example, here you can see two home ranges of two tigers. As some of you know, a lot of my work focuses on animal movement and analysis of animal movement, especially tigers and leopards. These are two tigers that share a part of home range. So the overlap area can give us an indication of there is an interaction between two individuals. Or if you plot their movement over time, so that is a space-time cube, then the times that they come close to each other or in close proximity of each other can indicate dynamic interaction. So dynamic interaction would be when two moving entities come close to each other at the same time. And static interaction would be closeness in space or sharing space, but it might not be necessarily at the same times. There are 3 very good review papers on this topic that I highly recommend. One is by Jennifer Miller in Tracks in Action in GIS, and also Jed Long and his colleagues, Teresa-Lynn Nelson. They also wrote a review paper on basic dyadic movement interaction in animal ecologies. So I highly recommend these papers if you're interested in this topic. And I'm so inspired by Jennifer's and Jed's work on movement interaction, and my work is very close to what basically Jed has started. So a lot of these measures work based on proximity, and basically, if you have two tracking data set, we measure the distances between point-to-point distances between the two individuals, and we try to identify interaction. However, as you know, proximity requires a threshold, like a buffer, and the size of the buffer basically influences how many times we the number of interactions we identify in our study or track data. So one of the proximity measure basically looks at a threshold and calculates how many times or the median distances between the two entities, or how many times these two entities come within a certain distance of each other, or that threshold. There are other distance measures that you can use, more like spatial distance measures such as pressure distance and Harsdorff distance that calculate like the minimum of distance between across a window of time. So if you consider this proximity measures across the entire data set, then you come up with a static measure of interaction. Or if you consider it as a moving window, then you can also calculate a dynamic, more dynamic measure of dyadic interaction. Other measures are, for example, other researchers suggested that you could look at not only point-to-point distances, but also any distance between one entity to every other point within a time window, and I calculate the mean distance this way. So there are several measures in this area, and oftentimes they are static, as the review by Jennifer showed. They focus on spatial proximity and more static proximity, and there's less focus on interaction over time. And that's why we need more measures that can capture dynamic interaction. They oftentimes rely on a distance threshold. And if you consider point-to-point distances, we basically need GPS tracking data that are measured at the same time. Basically, we need simultaneous fixes or the same number of fixes over time. And a lot of these measures, if they compute dynamic interaction, they focus mainly on direct interaction, meaning that synchronous interaction and interaction that happens at the same time. And there is very little work on delayed interaction or asynchronous interaction. A recent paper, again by Jed and Brandon and Jennifer, they looked at delayed interaction, which is very similar to what I'm describing here as well. And the idea is basically, if animals or entities are moving in the same space, can we measure the interaction between them based on the places that they go after a time delay, after a time lag? So they go to the same places with a time lag though. So my work is based on a space-time cube or time geography that was first introduced by Pakistan, and so is the work with by Jed Long and Brandon. So the idea is that if you track an animal or human over time, you get a space-time path of this individual. And if you have multiple individuals, then when they come close to each other in a space and time, well, I can replay this, but the idea is to figure out when they come close to each other at the same time, at the same location, or with a time lag, same location. So I use a space-time prism as a base for the time geography framework, which basically identifies the area that is accessible to an entity over a period of time, based on the time budget that we have and based on the speed of the entity. So that's the prism, or the area that an entity can reach over time, depending on the maximum speed that an entity has. We can compute this at each step at a time, basically the area that can be accessible by each entity within a time interval. For example, 10 minutes, that would be the area that the entity possibly can reach within that 10 minutes, depending on the maximum budget. Maximum speed. And then the time that is left, the time budget that it's left, basically possibly can be reached at this distance. And this area, the intersection between these two circles basically shows the area that the entity should be or is accessible to the entity within that at that time that we are interested in. And as you move through time, this potential terminal area will changes until we basically can quantify the whole NS. So Jet, Long, and Brandon use this notion of space-time prism and look at the intersection of this area that is basically the accessible area at each moment in time for the entity. So the idea is, if we intersect this for one entity with the other entity, this area would be the potential area for an interaction. And then Jet showed that you can use that to measure either spatial interaction between animals or dynamic interaction if you intersect this potential area over time between the two entities. And Brandon basically added a time lag, relaxed that time lag with a certain time distance threshold that should be specified with the domain scientists to look at interaction over time. So in our work, we developed a similar approach, which we'll call it Ortega, an object-oriented time geographic analytical approach to trace space-time contact between moving individuals. And the idea is that we are not going to look at the time intervals and how the potential path area intersect, but we look at the overall potential path area and the intersection between the two as a measure of, or as an area that possibly the two entities could intersect. So the common part of the potential path areas, as you can see here in 3D, there would be a space to interact for the two animals. These are the reachable spaces by the two entities. And then if the interaction happens to share a timeline, then we call it direct interaction, meaning that the interaction happens at the same time, same location. Otherwise, if the timeline do not overlap, then the interaction is a delayed interaction with a time lag. So we don't specify any previously defined time threshold for that. So again, visually, direct interaction or synchronous interaction is when contacts happens at the same time at the same locations. For example, these two tigers come into close proximity of each other at the same time in their shared space. Indirect interaction or delayed interaction happens when the contact happens after a delay. So this tiger comes to the same location of the other tiger after a certain delay in time. So we optimize the space-time intersection using an object-oriented model, which basically makes the ellipse or the space-time prism smart, meaning that it can memorize where the potential path areas were and where the intersection happens regardless of their time. So we identify moving entities as moving objects and their trajectories as trajectory objects. Each trajectory includes basically a series of space-time prisms, and each prism obviously has a potential path area as a projected 2D geographic area that is a projection of the space-time prism on geographic area. And then basically for each entity, we store the intersection of the two potential path areas as an attribute to that potential path area, so that our potential path areas remembers all the intersection that happens previously in the history of the track as an array. And basically we use that to optimize tracing contacts over time. So, and another advantage of that, this approach is that so previous approaches mainly focus on dyadic interaction, meaning that two individuals, but here we can also track interaction between multiple individuals. So for each trajectory, we compute the potential path areas and their space-time prisms, and then based on the areas that we are interested in, we apply a space-time indexing approach to limit the areas of intersection. So we don't intersect the PPAs that are very far apart each other in a space and time. And then using these algorithms, basically between each two individuals, we look for contacts, and then we store it in their intersected PPAs. And then based on whatever the application needs or contact tracing needs are, then you can return to the history of the interactions and return direct and indirect interactions at the last step. So just to go back and compare two approaches, so the common practice for most of the contact tracing apps and the Bluetooth-based apps are the spatial proximity at the same time. And basically, the proximity-based measures require a distance threshold that, depending on whatever distance threshold you set, you might identify some interactions or miss those. However, the potential path area considers the speed of the individual and the time between the 2 points. So we don't need a threshold for that to identify interaction. And then we don't need like simultaneous fixes to be able to look at the point-to-point distances, and the intersection of the potential path area even can identify that interaction that are not captured at the time that we have a GPS point. So the areas between the two GPS points are considered for potential interaction. So in order to test our study, so the model was, or tool was developed for tiger and leopard interaction, but since the COVID pandemic, we thought that, well, it would be nice to look at human interaction using GPS tracking data. So I was lucky enough to have Rongshan here at UCSB to help me with the analysis of about 400 individuals that were collected using GPS tracking data with frequency of 3 seconds over 3 days through the California Household Survey in 2013. We used that as a sample of cases to show whether this algorithm works or not. The data set includes 176 households in San Jose, and basically, when I talk about later within household and outside household, meaning that within household we have like moms and kids that they move together and they travel together, and then outside household would be interaction between people that they don't live together or they don't move together, but they have interaction with outside their household. So we applied the algorithm on all 402 individuals that we have. And so the top shows the result of the proximity-based approach, and the bottom part shows the results of Ortega. So for the proximity-based approach, we experimented with 100-meter buffer and 500-meter buffers. And as you can see, as the buffer increases, you can identify more interaction. And then Ortega basically doesn't require that buffer. Ortega identifies more interaction as compared to the proximity-based approach. So these are within household and these are outside household. Especially outside household, Ortega is capable of identifying more direct interaction, like at the same time, at the same space. And the reason being that we are not limited to identifying simultaneous fixes, the proximity between simultaneous fixes. So if a tracking data do not line up, then sometimes proximity-based approach misses that interaction. And as you can see here, a lot of nodes have no edges, meaning that no interaction were identified with the proximity-based approach. And as compared to Ortega, and Ortega also identified some clusters of more interaction, direct interaction, which indicates our household had more direct interaction. So these are individuals of the same household and interacting with individuals of different households. And as basically we, the number of counts increases with Ortega. So Ortega can identify more interaction with people outside household as compared to the proximity-based approach. And so we know that a lot of people in the data set interacted, so that the proximity-based approach misses a lot of those interactions, because a lot of people live at least with one person in the same household. And for the delayed interaction, so these are Ortega's result for delayed interaction over different delay timelines. So a 30-minute delay allowing 1 hour delay or 2 hours delay and more. And as you can see, the more delay we consider, the more fragmented this network becomes. So it shows basically it gets closer to a spatial interaction as we increase the delay, meaning that it identifies places that individuals interact over different timelines. For example, I go to the same gym as somebody else's from other household, but at different timelines. So, and then looking at within household and outside household, we can see that by increasing the delay, there is a chance that you identify contact or interaction or delayed interaction outside household. Obviously, the interaction between individuals within household increases too, but we identify also more interaction with other households. So the number H would be the household, and that is the person ID. So this person, for example, the person 1 interacted with 3 individuals of that household, and multiple individuals of other households, although over a period of time. And I should mention that this doesn't mean that they intentionally interacted or the interaction happened. It means that they've been at the same time, at the same location at different timelines. So then we looked at the impact of temporal scale on the analysis. Here, we are looking at the results of Ortega for within household interaction, and then over different time delays. As you can see, when you change the temporal resolution of the data, so we resampled the data for the standard analysis that I showed, we use 1 minute. But to change the temporal resolution, we basically skip every few points, and we resampled the data to 5-minute intervals, 10-minute intervals, and 20-minute and 30 minutes. As you can see, over time, within household interaction, increases over time. However, if you change the temporal resolution, that doesn't impact, so it doesn't have a significant impact on the number of interaction identified. And these are, I must say, so for example, interaction allowing 5 minutes or 30 minutes or 1 hour, and etc. So, and the reason being that because individuals mostly travel together, so their space-time presence or the potential path areas were close to each other over time. So changing the temporal resolution didn't impact that much. However, for outside household interaction, we see a different pattern, meaning that if you change the temporal resolution of tracking data, you can identify more possible interaction or possible contacts, and obviously over time delay, more contacts are or delayed contacts are identified. So the reason here is that basically by increasing the temporal resolution of the data or temporal scale, the time window, the ellipses become larger, and then there is more chance to intersect with the ellipses of other individuals who are not traveling together. So if you are in a store and somebody else it comes to the same store after a delay, you will be able to identify it as well. And also we can see that the impact seems to get higher when you increase the delay as well as increasing the temporal window. So here we are looking at the comparison between Ortega results and the proximity-based approach. The green shows proximity or Ortega within household. Blues show outside household contacts, and then the red is basically the total amount. So if we compare this, first of all, the proximity-based approach fails to identify outside household contact. As you can see here, the blue doesn't show any contact in proximity-based approach. However, Ortega can identify potential contact. And then, and the reason is basically because we don't have some simultaneous fixes, right? So because we consider the potential path area between the two GPS points, Ortega can identify those possible contacts. And then within household, though, we see a stable result over time, different time delays between the proximity-based and Ortega. And the reason we think it's because we have simultaneous fixes for individuals within the same household. And basically, the changing the temporal analysis scale influences delayed interaction, as I showed before, but not so much the direct interaction when people move together. So to conclude, movement is really key to analyze interaction between individuals, and that's very important for epidemic purposes and also prevention purposes in when we identify different measures to prevent the spread of disease, or even human-wildlife conflict, or also it has been a very important point of study for species competition as well. Contact tracing, with all the research going on contact tracing, we know that it might be helpful, but also we need to make careful considerations about not only the tracking accuracy and uncertainty of our tracking data, also the settings of tracking as well. We know that, for example, GPS tracking is less accurate indoor, and also the range of, if you look at Bluetooth contact tracing, basically the range of Bluetooth impacts the identification of potential contacts. So that is something to consider. And then most of the current technologies, basically, I can say almost all of them use proximity-based approaches. And as I showed, they might be good at looking when you want to identify direct contact or synchronous contact, but then they fail when for detecting delayed interaction. If, for example, the virus is in the air and somebody else moves to the same location after a delay, you are not going to identify that a potential exposure with such contact tracing apps. And as I showed, there is an impact based on what proximity measure or buffer you use, or what temporal scale you consider to analyze the interaction between individuals. And also, most of these approaches, they don't see the context of contacts, and also the setting where these contacts happens, right? So we don't know if there was a barrier between the two individuals or not, if there were like different stories of the same building. So it's the same location, but multiple stories. So you're not going to identify such barriers that actually isolates people from each other. These proximity-based and even time geography-based approaches are limited to identify barriers. So future research should focus on the context of contact, and also another important aspect is the duration of contact. How much or the time spent in contact with each other, or the duration of contact also has a great impact on an individual being infected or not, or in different applications. And obviously with any tracking comes privacy and ethical issues that we need to consider. Obviously our work here consider GPS tracking data, but not everybody is willing to share their GPS tracking data, or it's hard to even track everybody. And usually the contact tracing is successful when most people actually use it and report location. So that is a point of consideration as well. At the end, I would like to thank all my collaborators and students who made this research possible and helped me with the analysis, especially Rongshan and Evgeny have been very helpful in my mobility and COVID research, and Jasper from University of Minnesota helped a lot in analysis of tiger and leopard interaction that I didn't show much of it here, but the work actually started there, and it evolved to more contact tracing and human context. And Kostas, I'm grateful for the data set that he shared with me, so we could look at the interaction between humans as a different application than animal interaction. And then the work actually started in a collaboration with Shauna Herring from CUNY and my colleague at University of Minnesota, Jay Smith, who is a tiger biologist. And then I'm also grateful to the collaboration with Esri, and Nathan Shepard has been helping me with visualizing interaction, and hopefully we can make that a part of Esri as well for visualization. Well, thank you all for your time. I wish I could see you, but I'm happy to answer any question you might have.